You're probably thinking to yourself, what sort of voodoo is this? Well, there is no voodoo here. As hard as it is to believe, the people in these photos aren't actually headless. It's simply a manipulation of photography. In the 19th century, while other photographers took normal photos and made good money with them, Victorian photographers discovered that by combining images from multiple negatives, they were able to manipulate photos whichever way their clients requested. But when it comes to bizarre situations, this next photo is a bit more unsettling. Once upon a time, up to 30 to 60 million bison existed on the face of the earth. But as at the time this photo was taken in 1892, there were only about 456 in existence. Between 1850 to 1870, most bison herds were brutally hunted down and exterminated. This photograph represents how much of an endangered species bison was at the time and the demand for their preservation. However, another thought that's hard to imagine is what happened in the life of this young girl. This young girl's name was Olive Oatman. She was born in 1837 in Illinois. Olive was part of a Mormon family that embarked on a westward journey to find a new home in California. But in 1851, the family was attacked by a group of Native Americans, believed to be Yavapai, in what is now Arizona. But despite all, could Olive Oatman have healed from her terrible ordeal? Now, healing is all good and fine, but this next one takes it to a whole other level. This particular photo was captured in the 1890s by Frank G. Carpenter, and far from the looks of things, this masquerade-looking thing was actually a medicine man known to also be an exorcist and healer. The fascinating part about this is that this particular healer was not the only one. There were several medicine men and women in the indigenous parts of America who were revered and respected as healers and even spiritual leaders in the community. If you think this is a little creepy, wait till you see this. This photo was taken in 1887, and it is of the Apache spirit dancers, otherwise known as Gone, or mountain spirits. They were a representation of powerful and supernatural beings. Each of their costumes were of different beings to be revered and feared, and they were known for their spiritual dances. To those who do not understand the Apache tradition, these dancers could be scary and eerie. But none of this is as eerie as this next story. The little boy you see in this photo is Jimmy McKinn Santiago, and those people behind him are actually his captors. Here's what happened. Little McKinn once lived with his family in the lower Mimbres Valley in New Mexico, but when he was around 11 or 12, he was kidnapped by a group of Chiricahua Apache, led by Geronimo. Probably a serious case of Stockholm Syndrome. But while taking a photo with your captors is weird, nothing beats the type of photo you're about to see next. The man in the photo is in fact dead. In the 1800s, Victorian photographers offered to create a portrait of a deceased. It was still expensive, but not as much as painted portraits, and so post-mortem photography became a thing. So these portraits would usually look as though the deceased was doing something mundane like eating, sitting, standing, etc. And from the looks of things, they appeared to do a very good job of that. But apparently, it wasn't only loved ones who wanted to photograph the dead. This photo is that of a deceased outlaw named William Brazelton. He was so notorious and legendary, he wrote his name on the sands of time in American history. In this photo, he is dead and covered with a mask, the same way he would mask his face to commit crimes. His eventual death was cause for celebration. He is believed to have been born around 1849. Now, from the world of crime, let's venture into the world of entertainment with this inspiring photo. This man is a legend in American history. He came from nothing and took over the world of entertainment. He was born on February 26, 1846, in the Iowa Territory, and he became one of the most iconic figures of the American Old West. Buffalo Bill's real name was William Cody, and his fame began to spread. It was his transition from a frontier scout to a showman that cemented his place in history. You know when one small thing becomes such a big deal for no reason? Well, this next photo represents exactly that. These three men lying lifeless in their coffins tell a story of the aftermath of one of the most brutal gunfights in American history. As far as American frontier history is concerned, few events are as infamous as the gunfight at the OK Corral, which took place on October 26, 1881, in Tombstone, Arizona Territory. This legendary shootout, lasting only about 30 seconds, left 3 men dead and became a symbol of the Wild West's lawlessness and violence. What you see here is actually a very meticulous medical treatment by a very renowned surgeon named Louis Sayre. He was a charter member of several medical societies, including the American Medical Association, and served as its president in 1880. What you see in this photo is one of the methods he used in his private practice to stretch the spine and relieve stress. It involved his patients suspended in the air and hanging by their arms. Speaking of body parts, ever heard of this next outlaw? Big-Nose George Parrott was a notorious outlaw in the late 1800s, known for train and stagecoach robberies across Wyoming. Captured after killing 2 lawmen, he was sentenced to death and later lynched by a mob in 1881. After his death, his body was used in bizarre ways. Dr. John Osborne made shoes from his skin. Parts of his skull became an ashtray, and his death mask was preserved. What wasn't preserved, sadly, are the livelihoods of those who endured this next disaster. Back in 1894, Midland, Texas got hit with one of the wildest sandstorms the town had ever seen. Imagine a massive wall of dark sand and dust, rolling over the plains and swallowing everything in its way. Houses, roads, you name it. The storm left the town covered in grit, with crops and homes damaged, and everyday life came to a standstill as people hunkered down. Photos of that day showed just how intense life could get out there in the West, where these kinds of unpredictable and powerful storms were all part of the experience. But natural disasters are one thing, but this next photo is the reality of war. In 1862, the Dakota War forced settlers in Minnesota to abandon their homes and seek safety as tensions between the Dakota Sioux and the U.S. government reached a boiling point. Families packed what little they could carry and left behind everything they'd built, fleeing through rugged terrain to escape the violence. Photos and accounts from that time show the urgency and fear on their faces as they traveled on wagons and by foot, hoping to find refuge. However, there was no refuge for this next outlaw when the law caught up with him. Jesse James. The name alone conjures images of Wild West shootouts, dusty saloons, and the open plains. But behind the outlaw legend lies a man whose story is more layered than just good guy versus bad guy. Some say he was an American Robin Hood, robbing from the rich to help the poor, while others paint him as a ruthless, cold-blooded killer with a taste for mayhem. Jesse started his outlaw life early. Born in Missouri in 1847, he was just a teenager when he joined the Confederate guerrilla forces during the Civil War. Forces against this next character were way too strong. Tom Blackjack Ketchum, an infamous outlaw, met a particularly grim end during his execution in New Mexico in 1901. When he was hanged, the process went tragically wrong. Due to miscalculations in the drop height and Ketchum's weight, the force was too great, resulting in his decapitation. Gruesome photos captured the botched execution, making it a disturbing yet iconic moment in Wild West history. These images are haunting reminders of the harsh and often unpredictable nature of justice in that era. If someone from the 1800s saw this next photo, they'd be grinning ear to ear. In the rough mining town of Deadwood, South Dakota, the notorious Badlands section was home to some of the rowdiest saloons of the Wild West. Photos from this gritty strip show a lively mix of gamblers, drinkers, outlaws, and travelers packed into saloons, many in states of raucous activity. These spots were notorious for fistfights, quick draws, and games of chance, creating an atmosphere that was both thrilling and dangerous. The images offer a raw glimpse into a side of frontier life that was equal parts lawless and lively, a true Wild West spectacle. But speaking of spectacle, check out this next photo. Billy the Kid, one of the most famous outlaws of the Wild West, was captured in several iconic photos, but perhaps the most memorable is the one of him as a young man. Taken in the early 1880s, the photo shows Billy with a calm expression, dressed in typical frontier clothes and holding a rifle. His image became synonymous with rebellion and lawlessness, embodying the unpredictable nature of the Wild West. Despite his violent life, Billy's youthful appearance in the photo makes him seem almost sympathetic. This next photo is like a mix of the past and future, weird but rewarding. One of the most bizarre photos of the Wild West era shows Geronimo, the famed Apache leader, dressed in full traditional attire, sitting behind the wheel of a car around 1905. This image is striking because it juxtaposes two vastly different worlds. The once fiercely independent Apache leader, who fought against the U.S. government, now in the midst of a rapidly changing society. The photo symbolizes the collision of the old and new, as Native Americans like Geronimo were being forced to adapt to modernity after years of conflict. When it comes to conflict, though, this next photo tells quite a popular tale. One of the most iconic photos from the Wild West era shows the bullet-riddled car in which Bonnie and Clyde were killed, surrounded by Texas Rangers. The infamous outlaw couple's death, in a hail of gunfire in 1934, shocked the nation. The car, filled with holes from the ambush, became a symbol of their violent and tragic end. The photo, capturing the lawmen standing proudly next to the car, offers a stark reminder of how quickly their wild crime spree came to a bloody conclusion. Want to see something strange? Take a look at this next photo. One of the most famous images of Calamity Jane shows her dressed in men's clothing, embodying the defiance and toughness of the Wild West. In this portrait, she's wearing a hat, a vest, and pants, clothing that was far from typical for women at the time. Calamity Jane was known for her rugged lifestyle, often riding and fighting alongside men, which made her a figure of both fascination and admiration. This photo perfectly captures her rebellious spirit and desire to reject conventional gender norms. Apparently, she was not the only badass woman of her time. This photo is a pretty incredible glimpse into a time when women in rodeos were pretty rare. We're talking about the late 1800s here, and most of the attention in rodeos was on the men, riding broncos, roping cattle, all that Wild West action. But this woman, she's breaking the mold. Back then, rodeos were still mostly a guy's game, but women were starting to carve out their space, especially in Wild West shows. You'd see ladies showing off their trick riding skills or competing in roping events. It's wild to think about, right? This next photo is even wilder. The photo you're referring to is an iconic and unsettling image of Joseph F. Smith's family, which was taken in the late 1800s and captures the sheer scale of his polygamous lifestyle. Joseph F. Smith, the fifth president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS, was a key figure in Mormon history and a direct descendant of the church's founder, Joseph Smith. He was known for his extensive polygamous family, which was not uncommon in the early days of Mormonism, particularly in the Utah Territory. Speaking of American history, this next man needs to be mentioned. Marcus Lafayette, Mark Frink, 1860 to 1929, was born in San Bernardino, California, to Horace Monroe Frink and Polly Ann DeWitt McMahon. His family had strong ties to the early Mormon settlers in the region, with his father being a personal friend of Brigham Young and a guide during the Mormon migration west. In 1880, Marcus married Samantha Caroline Wilson, and together they had 7 children. Marcus was a farmer and orange grower, residing in San Bernardino County for much of his life. The Frink family also played a role in the local community. From a family man, let's now check out some warriors. These are from the late 1800s and are a striking reminder of the fierce resistance Native American tribes mounted against U.S. expansion. Many of these images, like the ones showing warriors preparing for battle or in full regalia, capture their pride, strength, and unwavering courage in the face of overwhelming odds. These photos not only document the boldness of their resistance, but also challenge the typical American frontier narrative, which often frames Native Americans as either victims or adversaries to the settlers. This video will not be complete if we do not talk about this next one. After the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral, Tombstone streets simmered with both tension and intrigue. The immediate aftermath was almost as wild as the shootout itself, with the bodies of the dead Cowboys, Tom McClory, Frank McClory, and Billy Clanton, displayed at a local undertaker's window. This grim display sent a clear message, but it also marked the beginning of a divided reaction in town. Some people sympathized with the Earps and saw their actions as justified self-defense, while others sided with the Cowboys, claiming the shootout was a disproportionate response. Now let's talk about some good old American legend. Here's a snapshot of Nat Love, one of the most legendary African-American cowboys of the Wild West, around 1900. Born into slavery in 1854 in Tennessee, Nat gained his freedom after the Civil War and headed west to start fresh. And boy, did he make a name for himself. Love quickly became known for his skills as a cowboy, especially in rodeo competitions. He earned the nickname Deadwood Dick after a big win at a rodeo in Deadwood in 1876. Talk about a guy who knew how to ride and rope with the best of them. While this cowboy was busy getting famous, these spirit dancers had a different agenda. This picture, taken in 1899, captures Apache spirit dancers, wearing striking hoods and masks, taking part in a powerful ritual meant to summon spirits from the underworld. This group wasn't just Apache. It included people from various native tribes across the Southwest, all united by the belief that they could call upon spirits to protect their people. Spiritual ceremonies like these were a cornerstone of Apache culture, as well as many other tribes in the region. Through dances and sacred rituals, participants sought to bridge the gap between the physical and spiritual worlds, ensuring their community's safety. The picture you're about to see is an unforgettable moment captured in a snapshot. The image of the last Deadwood coach making its final trip is a snapshot of history in motion. The old, weathered coach clatters down the dusty road, a symbol of the wild frontier days drawing to a close. It's the end of an era for Deadwood, a town built on gold, grit, and a whole lot of drama. This particular coach, which had made countless runs bringing people and supplies in and out of the rugged Black Hills, was making its final journey in 1912, as the railroad finally connected Deadwood to the outside world. It was a final salute to the days when a stagecoach ride was a real adventure, and the Wild West was still alive and kicking. But for this hunter, a goodbye was the last thing he wanted. He had a skill that even the president could not resist. Imagine showing up to meet the president with a gift that's way more wild than a simple handshake. Seth Kinman, a legendary hunter and character straight out of the Wild West, did just that when he met President Andrew Johnson. Instead of a typical token of appreciation, he crafted a chair like no other, built from actual elk horns and draped with bear skin. The result? A seat fit for the frontiersman himself, and surely one of the wildest pieces of furniture to ever grace the White House. President Johnson was probably as shocked as you will be when you see the next picture. Back in the 1930s, rodeos were more than just about bucking broncos. They featured jaw-dropping stunts that had the crowd on the edge of their seats. This picture captures a shocking occurrence at a California rodeo back in the day. One fearless woman and her horse taking things to the next level, soaring right over a convertible parked smack in the middle of the arena. Talk about horsepower. This gravity-defying spectacle had everyone gasping. This stunt certainly captures the thrill, guts, and pure spirit of the Wild West, with a dash of old-school Hollywood flair. Meet another woman who was determined to soar. In an era when women were relegated to the background, this fierce woman decided to take the lead. Annie Oakley wasn't just one of America's first celebrities. She was a well-known sharpshooter and also a fierce advocate for women taking control. Literally, in this picture, you can see Annie holding up her trusty rifle, rallying groups of women to learn the art of shooting. She wasn't content to keep her wild skills to herself. She wanted other women to feel strong, stand tall, and be independent. Speaking of standing tall, this man made tall men look like dwarfs. Meet Ralph Tex Medson, the towering cowboy who could stop a crowd just by showing up. As you can see by the look on that man's face, Tex was unbelievably tall. Standing over 7 feet tall, he didn't just blend into the Wild West, he practically looked over it. Wherever Tex went, jaws dropped, and before long, he was invited to parades and special events all over. With his signature cowboy hat and larger-than-life presence, turning heads and shaking hands with fans who couldn't believe their eyes, makes you wonder how his romantic partner looked standing beside him, right? Okay, that's enough imagination. Do you know about the card game that men were with back in the day? In this picture, it's 1895 in an Arizona saloon, and the place is buzzing with excitement as gamblers gather around to play Faro, the Wild West's favorite card game. Back then, rolling the dice on life was second nature for folks brave enough to leave the comfort of the East in search of fame and fortune. Believe it or not, being a gambler was as respected as being a doctor or a lawyer. In this dimly lit saloon, each bet was about making money and living life on the edge. Have you ever heard of someone who mistakenly shot their foot? Well, you're about to. He never killed a man that did not need killing. These words, which were written boldly on this man's tombstone, reflected the life he lived. Clay Allison was a cattle rancher with a reputation for being one of the Wild West's most dangerous and unpredictable characters. A former Confederate soldier, his fiery temper was legendary, and it usually led to gunfights wherever he went. Whether facing off with a civilian or clashing with the law, Allison was always ready to throw down. His reckless nature was so intense that he even shot himself in the foot once. Talk about bad luck. Ever been served beer at a courthouse? This next picture will surprise you. Check out this picture of Judge Roy Bean's courthouse, which also doubled as a saloon in Langtree, Texas, back in 1900. Talk about mixing business with pleasure. Roy Bean, known as the law west of the Pecos, wasn't just a judge. He ran the bar too, and his courtroom decisions were often more about his own wild sense of justice than any formal law. Can you imagine walking into this place, not knowing if you'd be greeted by a judge ready to hand out a sentence or a bartender serving up a cold one? Or maybe both at the same time? That's the Wild West for you. Speaking of justice, these men were willing to die for justice to prevail. Here we've got a classic shot of the Texas Rangers, weapons drawn and ready to defend the state's borders. These guys are legends, and for good reason. The Rangers got their unofficial start back in 1823 when Stephen F. Austin brought them together to keep the peace, and by 1835, they were officially recognized. Over the years, they've built a fierce reputation for hunting down outlaws, battling invasions, and maintaining order along Texas's rugged borders. Interestingly, the Texas Rangers still exist as an elite unit within the Texas Department of Public Safety, continuing to uphold their legacy of justice. In the end, all of these photographs tell rich and disturbing stories that make up American history. If you've enjoyed this so far, tell us in the comments which of these stories resonates with you the most. Also, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more fascinating, creepy, and disturbing photos that contribute to the rich and boisterous American history.